So here we have one of these wonderful illustrations that you've included in one of your books
Sure.
that I very much appreciated. So just to provide a visual description, we have the start kind of flag, and we have the stick person, and they can go on a journey, and then we end it says awesome future learner, and there's these cool like shiny lines and all those sort of things, and I just love that. So you have it in both of your books. You have these wonderful drawings and images, and they're things I don't necessarily see in more teaching and learning books, at least that I've been reading, but they really help illustrate your points and they really add character. Can you talk more about just kind of those fun little images that
Yeah.
our readers get both kind of the inspiration, the process, maybe how your publisher reacted when you said like, yes, I'm gonna have these stick figures.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that was really important to me when I was writing the book was that the book kind of eat its own dog food. Like if I'm saying visual is important, or if I'm saying conversational language is important, or something,
Yeah.
metaphors and analogies are important. If any of these things are important, then I need to also kind of be using it. And that's feedback that I've gotten from people, is that they really feel like the book did that. And
Hmm.
I value that incredibly, because, you try and you hope it
Yeah.
works.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I really wanted to do I was like so naive that this book I was working on in like 2010. So obviously it's been a while now, the first book. But I was so naive about like, I want to do a really visual book, and just how much like effort goes into that. It's a lot, it turns
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of people involved. I actually really was fortunate in my publisher, which is Peach Pit New Writers. It's now part of Pearson. But I was really fortunate in them in that they supported it pretty well. They contacted an acquisition edit. I had been working on a book proposal for a few years, but an acquisition editor actually contacted me on the strength of some blog posts that I had done, and there's
Oh.
a longer story to it than that. But so they had actually reached out, which was great, because they were absolutely one of the publishers I'd sort of identified. And part of the reason I had liked them was specifically Steve Krug's Don't Make Me Think. They were the publisher behind that book, which is sort of that first book for UX practitioners.
Oh, sure.
And then Robin Williams, the Non-Designer's Design book, which is sort of a first book for people who want to do some graphic, work on graphic
Mm.
design stuff.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
And so they had already done some of these sort of first book things, which is what I was hoping to do for instructional design, that type of book. In addition to which, they were a tech company. Like, they did mostly tech books, but they had this side in print called Voices That Matter, where they would do more design related books. So I was kind of right at the end of their, um, what the kinds of books that they did. And so it
Yeah.
was actually, they weren't traditionally a learning and development publisher. That was maybe more Wiley or ATD or one of those books. But because they were a tech book publisher, they were used to budgeting and having books that had full color printing, which is
Oh.
actually really kind of difficult to get.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
we had a real debate about it with the second book, whether I really needed it, and I really wanted the books to match. So I'm fortunate that they let me do that. But it also brings up the price point of the book, and that's a reality of it, right?
Yep.
Like, you know, uh, I would like my books to be as cheap as possible, because even if I make less money, I'd still rather have more copies out there. But I also recognize that printing costs are what they are, and here we are. So, um, and I was trying initially to work with an illustrator, but it was just taking too long, and it was going to be too
Oh,
costly.
sure.
Like, it just, because I mean, I'd be like, it's close, but it's not quite right, whatever,
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
And so in the end, I had a couple of different illustration styles I was thinking about using with the book, including the one that wound up in there, which is just me doing stick figures.
Uh-huh.
And I specifically, was inspired by the webcomic XKCD, if you've ever seen that one.
Okay,
He
yeah.
does a lot of like science explanations and stuff, but he does these whole comics that have, you know, big, complicated, fabulous stuff. But it's all stick figures, and
Yeah.
they're very emotive stick figures, and you really get a sense of them and all this kind of stuff. And since then, there's been things like Wait, but why? That blog has also used a
Hmm.
lot of like hand drawing stick figure kinds of things to very good effect. And so there's a precedent kind of out there in the world for these. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, maybe I can do it too. Let's see if this works. And it turned out really, pretty well. And people seem
Yeah.
to like them for the most part. Every once in a while, I'll get somebody where it's like, this is childish. And I'm like, all right, well, it's not for you then.
Yep.
So,
Exactly.
but generally speaking, people seem to resonate well with those, and they, wound up being, something I could do. I had a somebody who was like, would translate them into Illustrator and prep the graphics for me and things
Oh,
like that.
sure. Yeah.
But yeah, no, that's just me doing a whole lot of, drawing a whole lot of stick figures and pictures and things like that. So,
Love it. Well, bravo. It just makes for just a really, really cool learning experience.
mhm,
Again, I have nothing against reading dissertations or the dry
right.
academic Like there's great stuff in there. But for me, like this was a treat. Like, whoa, and like all the visuals are like reinforcing what we're talking about. Like things are sticking. This is amazing.
The other big inspiration, since we talked about kind of where did I, my initial learning experiences, the other
Yeah.
big inspiration is Kathy Sierra,
Okay.
and I feel like people don't know her very much anymore. She's kind of retired, and I think she is training Icelandic ponies, or I believe
Oh,
that's right.
nice.
So she's doing other stuff these days, but she did a whole series of books that were like technology books. So Headfirst Java was the big one that they started with, and then she and Bert Bates, her husband and partner, edited a whole series of books for O'Reilly, and she had a blog called in the 2000s called Creating Passionate Users, and she did a lot of graphics and drawings, and just had a very direct kind of conversational style, but is easily one of the, I think, best instructional designers, ever. And I feel like every time I think I've come up with a kind of a genuinely original idea, I'll go back and I'll look and I'm like, oh no, Kathy talked about that first. Um, but but I still highly recommend her stuff. And I think that's another, she has a book called Badass Making Users Awesome, I want to say is the subtitle, but
Oh,
and that's it has a lot of really great stuff in it about skill development and things like that. And so people who know her stuff know that I'm um, kind of riffing off of her a little bit too,
yeah.
which I did with her blessing. She was very nice about it, uh, but she was very influential as well.
Thank you for sharing that. Um, so on the topic of both book development and also going we were talking about the rider and the elephant. So in
Yeah.
Design for How People Learn, you included these, ideas of the brain being like an elephant in the rider. The rider is the rational, knowledge-driven, and the elephant is just this powerful force, visceral force driven by gut feelings. Can
Mm-hmm.
you talk about how the process, about how that idea grew from, something that you talk about in your book as an illustration, and how that grows into the title of your latest
Yeah,
book?
that was a metaphor that I first encountered in Jonathan Haidt's book, The Happiness Hypothesis. So I think
Okay.
he gets kind of the most immediate sort of modern credit for it. He also has done, I mean, it also came from, I think, Buddhism, probably. I mean, it had
Hmm.
he was talking about like some ancient philosophy stuff and what that could tell us about kind of modern happiness. He's a psychologist, and he's now writing about like anxiety and adolescence. So he kind of has jumped.
Yeah.
He did stuff on politics. He did stuff on a bunch of different things. So he's been kind of all over the place. Um, but in that book, he had talked about kind of there's sort of this dual decision making idea, in terms of how we make decisions, and it
Yeah.
goes to and the metaphor, and you see it in a lot of other places. So Daniel Kahneman talks about system 1 and 2 in Thinking Fast and Slow, and you see some analogous. They're not exactly identical in the way they're described, but they're close enough for kind of comparison's sake. So you see these kind of dual decision making models in a lot of psychology and behavioral economics and, some of those kinds of disciplines. I happen to like The Rider and the Elephant. I think it's, once you explain it, people totally get it. And,
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
really like kind of resonates and sticks with people. And one of the biggest challenges we have in a lot of educational design is we put most of the burden on the writer. And we're like, you just have, it's your job, student, to keep your elephant in check. And that is asking a lot because
Yeah.
it's we've had all of these things about our shrinking attention spans and so on and
Hmm.
so forth, and I tend to view them, most of those claims, pretty skeptically.
Uh-huh.
But I will admit that we all have kind of a habit of flipping to the next thing if something fails to hold our attention, right? Like
Yeah.
that is
Yep.
something that I think is absolutely enabled by the technology.
Hmm.
I'm not a TikTok person, but occasionally I'm like, you get into this like video shorts game and you're like, oh, if this
Yeah.
doesn't engage me in the proverbial 8 seconds or something, if you want to flip to the next one or
Yep.
something.
Mhm.
um and but there's actually some evidence to support the idea that attention spans are actually improving in some ways. I think it's a test where they'll have people go through and look for detail oriented things, and they were actually seeing some improvement in that. That probably correlates to the fact that we also are seeing, a slight uptick in the population and IQ scores over time and things like that
Hmm.
too. I don't know if it's the same causality, but they seem to be following a similar line. Um, and so where is this disconnect, right? Our attention
Yeah.
spans are crazy short, but yet actually maybe they're getting better, longer.
Mm.
And we can all watch like, binge watch like many hours of
Yeah.
Netflix.
Yeah.
So I think one of the big things is if you're only engaging the writer, so it's only analytical, it's only intellectual, it's only like here you have to force yourself to pay attention, then you're gonna kind of um, run out of energy there. If your rider is dragging your elephant along, you're
Yeah.
going to eventually just get tired of it. Like when I have to sit down and force myself to do tech stuff, like I'm
Yep.
lucky if I get 10 solid minutes before I want a cookie. And but if I'm doing something I enjoy, you can do it for hours and hours and hours, or something that I'm fundamentally interested in. It's no problem to pay
Mhm.
attention. And so we need to be careful about those kinds of things, because if we're putting this heavy burden on, you are going to force yourself to pay attention, doesn't matter how dry this is, we should expect some limitations to how long people can do that. If we can create, learning activities that have more of both things, like there's an interesting story that I'm following, or I'm trying to solve a problem, or something that kind of makes it feel immediate for people, which is a big
Yeah.
piece of it, or visceral, or has an emotional engagement, or any of those kinds of things, then it's a lot easier for people to stay engaged, and we don't bump into those alleged limits to people's attention spans.
In part four of our conversation, Julie talks about what we can learn about shared values from Don't Mess with Texas.